Well, last time we gave Aquinas a conditional approval in the sense that we said, let us imagine that we can believe in an uncaused first cause, or a multiplicity of them at least. Where can he go from there with the use of reason alone? And the first step in his argument in trying to elucidate the nature of God, you recall, was the point that God is entirely simple. And you remember why he was entirely simple. God is pure form. Now, to illustrate that, you remember that angels, they had form and an immaterial suppositum. You remember you might have an archangel, and that would be one form of angel, and then there'd be a form of cherub, of cherubim. And within that form of angel, there could be no difference, because I take it that angels have a purely immaterial suppositum. That is, imagine you had immaterial cookie dough and a star-shaped cookie. Well, the dough would take the star shape the same every time, wouldn't it? So all angels would start off like identical twins, but as we said, an angel having free will could sin. So Satan could debase his nature, while, let's say, Michael could have a good nature, because they made different choices. One chose to worship God and one chose to defy God. Cherubim, again, would all be identical twins, but they again could have free will that would differentiate them. We, however, are very different. We have matter mixed with our nature. So we never take the form of being human perfectly. And therefore, we differ within our nature from birth. We aren't just differentiated by characterological choices. We take the essence of being human differently. Again, imagine a five-pointed star where the material dough sticks at one point for one cookie and then sticks at another point for another cookie. We're better off, of course, than rocks because they have a purely material suppositum. Thanks that you're a mixture of matter and mind, you have excellences a rock cannot duplicate. For example, you can choose to be virtuous, while no rock can evidence moral virtue. God is entirely different. God is pure form or essence with no suppositum at all. That is, he's absolute form. He's analogous to Plato's chief good. You remember Plato's chief good was a sort of absolute form of perfection. And different perfections partook of that, but they were particularized. You know, the perfection of a human society is moral perfection. The perfection of a painting is beauty. The perfection of a scientific theory is truth. The perfection of a chair is that it's a perfect thing for sitting on. So you remember the chief good was not wrapped around any suppositum at all. That is, it would have to be absolute perfection. And God is analogous to that. He would be pure form or essence. And therefore he is without suppositum. He exists only as an absolute form. So we now have reached at the second point of Aquinas' argument. At this point, we can move on to the third step and solve the problem we've had up to now, namely the possibility of a multiplicity of gods. And the solution is staring us in the face. I take it, God cannot be different, gods cannot be different by their essence, because they're absolute form or essence. That is, the only thing different from absolute form or essence is determinated form. Or the only thing different from necessary being is contingent being. So there can only be one Godhead. That is, there can only be one kind of God. You can have different kinds of rational creatures. It's possible that on Mars there is another species of rational creatures that are a mixture of mind and matter. So we have a suppositum, and we have different essences. You differ by your essence from a cat or dog. You differ by your essence from a Martian. But you cannot have gods differing by their essences, because the only essential difference from pure form or essence would be determinated essence. In other words, there can be only one Godhead. There can only be one kind of God. If God is necessary being, an uncaused first cause, anything that differs essentially from God is a contingent being. Now that we have established there is one Godhead, we can see that that Godhead could not stamp out a variety of identical twin gods, because that's possible only if you have a suppositum. If there's no cookie dough at all you have is the pure, perfect, star-shaped mold. So St. Thomas would see, if you reason properly, you see that if there is one uncaused first cause, if there is one necessary being, it must be unique. Initially, the argument seems to allow for a multiplicity of perfect beings or uncaused first causes. But if you reason properly, you see there is only one Godhead. Anything essentially different from necessary being would be contingent being and not a God at all. And since God is without suppositum, you can't have a lot of identical twin gods. I mean, when you have the dough, you can stamp out a lot of particulars. If you have just the mold, you're stuck with the one mold. Any questions then as to how St. Thomas solves the problem of God being entirely one? Now, we've already said that God is absolutely perfect. Now, why is that? Well, perfection goes with form. That is, you are a more perfect creature than a rock. First, you can have knowledge, which is a kind of perfection, isn't it? Well, a rock has no mind and can't know anything. So the fact that you have the form of being human and you have a mixed suppositum means that you have perfections a rock doesn't. And I take it you can manifest moral virtue. You can make virtuous choices, while a rock can make no choices at all. You are not as perfect as an angel. I take it an angel is a better knower than you, in that an angel need not use its senses to collect knowledge. That is, we have to crawl towards knowledge. We have bodies. Every angel can communicate with every other angel instantaneously. Imagine how much further science would be advanced if scientists could do that. So angels are more perfect knowers than you are. Why? Because they take their form perfectly while you take your form imperfectly. You remember, every archangel takes the form of archangel perfectly. It has an immaterial suppositum. So the extent to which form is undiluted determines your degree of perfection. Well, you can now see that God as absolute form would have to be absolute perfection. In other words, the more you have form, undeterminated or undiluted, the more perfect you are. You're more perfect than a rock. An angel is more perfect than you. God as absolute form would have to be absolute perfection. We have now solved our second problem. You remember our second dangling problem was that if the universe is material, we would have to find in the cause what we find in the effect, and therefore God would have to be material. We now see that positing something as an uncaused first cause of the universe means that by that very fact, it does not share the materiality of the universe. In other words, Aquinas would say, if you meditate for a moment on what an uncaused first cause would have to be, it would have to be a necessary being, right? The only thing that can be a necessary being is something uncaused. If you're not entirely simple, you have parts, and something else would have to put those parts together, wouldn't it? You see the point? I mean, any contingent being is composed of both form and suppositum, and you can only come into existence when an agent presses that form on the suppositum. You have to make the cookies, right? But a creature that is entirely simple, it, of course, is uncreated. It just has existence as a necessary being. And further, we now see that such a creature, because it would be pure form, could not possibly resemble anything but the formal portions of the universe. That is, all the perfections in the universe have an analogy to God. None of them reach his absolute perfection, of course. But none of the parts of the universe that derive from suppositums would resemble God.
Does that mean angels are necessary?
Pardon? We'll find out why angels are necessary in a moment. But at present, we're only trying to show you that we've solved our two hitherto unsolved problems. God must be entirely one. There can be only one Godhead, and there can only be one exemplification of that Godhead. And secondly, since God is pure form or essence, only the formal portions of the universe are analogous to God. And of course, the formal portions of the universe are what inject into it a measure of perfection. Its imperfection comes from its supposita, whether material or a mixture of matter and mind. And even being a determinated mind means an angel can't be a perfect knower, can it? Because although it takes the form of archangel perfectly, to be an archangel is not to have the knowledge of a cherubim, or to be a cherubim is not to have the knowledge of a seraphim, or the virtues. Archangels were supposedly more noble angels than cherubim. That is a bit of a mystery, but presumably Scripture indicates that. So thus far, we don't know why we have angels around at all. That's quite true. But we've solved our outstanding problems regarding the number of gods and the analogy between God and the universe. Now, we've said that God is undeterminated. That is, he's not limited in any way. What limits the virtues of form is being impressed on a suppositum. And God is not determinated in any way by a suppositum. Now, what perfections does he have? Well, we already have seen, have we not, that the more you are pure form, the more knowledgeable you are. And God as absolute form would have to be an absolute knower, which is to say that he's omniscient. Now that, of course, creates a new problem. What is it? If God is all-knowing, he has known the entire history of the universe from all time, hasn't he? What problem does that create for a Christian? For free will, isn't it? You know, it looks as if we would have to be determined. And if we were determined, I presume salvation and damnation would make no sense. I mean, you don't kick a rock for falling on you, do you? That's rather odd. So we now have a new problem. If God is omniscient, how is that compatible with free will among human beings? Secondly, God must be omnipotent. You're more powerful than a rock, and an angel is more powerful than you. And God, as totally unlimited form, would be all-powerful. Well, if God is all-powerful, doesn't that mean that he is someone who can who determines everything through causality? Didn't we say that there are a chain of causes going from the present right to God as an uncaused first cause? Well, how does a chain of causality leave room for free will? You know, if everything that exists in the present is determined by the causes that existed a moment ago, which is determined by the causes that existed a moment before that, and all these causal chains lead back to the potency of God, it appears, again, that there is no room for free will, that we live in a totally determined universe. Also, I take it God's virtue is undiluted. You can be more virtuous than a rock. A rock cannot choose to be faithful to its partner. An angel is more virtuous than you. An angel can worship God with a totality that we lack. I mean, we to some degree are rooted in earth, while the angel can worship God with an intensity that you cannot, at least in this life. God, then, must be totally undiluted virtue, which means he's entirely benevolent. And now we have a second new problem. If God is all benevolent, how can evil exist in the universe? The problem of evil, correct? So we've got two problems off our back, only to now be loaded with two new problems that St. Thomas has to solve. Any questions then about the two new problems that have arisen from our solution to the old problems? We're over here.
Just with omnipotence, I've heard an argument that could God create a rock that was too heavy for him to lift?
Yes, well, you see, that would be like asking God to create a square circle. Yeah. You see, it's asking the logically impossible. The logically impossible is not a true limitation on your potency. If you said to a geometer, can you be such a good geometer as to invent a problem of geometry you can't solve? That's a very odd request, isn't it? I mean, if he's a really good geometer, he can solve all problems. And to say, you know, can God make a rock so heavy he can't lift it? We could, these is really just like saying, can God make a square circle? Of course not. These things are logically impossible. What we have to ask is, can God do anything that is logically possible? And that would be the true question of whether he was omnipotent. Well, let's see if Aquinas, any other questions? Let's see if Aquinas can give us solutions to the new problems that have arisen. Let's first take the problem of evil. Why could God have not created a perfect universe? Well, what is the only thing that can be perfect? An uncreated thing, an uncaused cause, right? So you're asking God to duplicate himself. That is, the only existing entity that's perfect is God. To ask God to make a perfect universe is asking him to make a second God. And that, of course, is a logical impossibility. Anything that is created is not an uncaused first cause. Anything that is not an uncaused first cause is not a necessary being. Anything that is not a necessary being is not pure form. Anything that is not pure form is not perfect. You see how the logic of what we have done so far makes the desire for a perfect universe absurd. That's a desire for a second God. Now you might say, why didn't God stop with a universe of angels only? Can anyone see the answer to that? Well, let's use a modern analogy. Imagine someone said to you, the violins are the noblest instrument in the orchestra. So why don't we have an orchestra of all violins? Why, to a lover of music, is that a bad idea? That is, imagine we had no musical instrument but the violin. And let's imagine we all think the violin is over here.
If you had nothing to contrast it with, you wouldn't be able to enjoy it as much?
All we would have are string quartets, wouldn't we? We wouldn't have symphonies, we wouldn't have piano concertos, we wouldn't have flute concertos. In other words, it may be that all the remaining instruments in the orchestra are less noble, but the combination of the whole orchestra is a more wonderful thing than merely the violins alone. Now, it is true that angels are superior to ourselves, at least virtuous angels are. But we can manifest a kind of virtue that no angel can. No angel can resist the temptation of drunkenness, because they don't have bodies, do they? No angel can resist the temptations of gluttony. No angel can show charity to another angel, because no angel is ever going to be hungry, are they? Well, you can manifest charity to other people. No angel can show fidelity to a partner, because angels do not have sex. They're not sexed creatures. You see the point? So even though angels are superior to you, you are like the flutes and the harps and the rest of it. You're not as good as a violin, but you contribute a kind of excellence to the universe that a universe of angels alone would lack. You see the point? So if God wants to be benevolent, he wants the universe to have as many kinds of excellence in it as possible.
But because God is omnipotent, doesn't he logically exhibit all kinds of excellence?
You mean, why did he bother to create a universe at all?
No, that's not my question.
Well, that is a question sometimes people have raised. If God is pure form or excellence, why create anything less excellent? The answer, of course, is that a benevolent creature has to have an object. Otherwise, you're merely a narcissistic creature loving yourself, correct? So you must have an object in order to exercise love. But what were you asking?
More of the question, in the actual argument itself. You know, the argument goes that if the argument is that humans exhibit a kind of excellence
that angels lack,
pure beings cannot.
Yeah, that beings with an immaterial suppositum. They don't have bodies, so they can't manifest the virtues that we can through a virtuous use of our body.
So is that saying then that humans can exhibit excellences that God cannot?
Yes, but they are lesser excellences. That is, they can, yes, that's quite correct. A universe with God only would not have exhausted all the logical possibilities in terms of excellence. And of course, a beautiful sunset is inferior to moral virtue, but it has a kind of virtue that you can't exhibit, doesn't it? That is, it has an awe-inspiring beauty, a certain sublimity that I can't exhibit. So we see then that in order to exploit all the excellences possible, you had to have form impressed on a material suppositon, form impressed on a mixed suppositon, that's us, and form impressed on an immaterial suppositum, that's the angels. So the only way to logically exhaust all the possible excellences is to have created a universe of matter, human beings or mixed creatures, and of course pure spirits or angels. Now we know why angels exist. Someone raised that point earlier. Now, you can always say, well, what about Hitler? Well, of course, that means that you want a universe of robots. That is, if people genuinely have free will, they have to be free to choose either good or evil, don't they? And the only way you can guarantee creatures always choosing good, unless, of course, they have the holy will of God. I mean, since God is incorruptible, He will always exercise His will benevolently. But the only way a less than perfect creature can have free will is that it is at least possible for that creature to choose evil. It may be that there are saints among us who never did choose evil, but they were subject to temptation, were they not? I mean, the reason we think of them as saints is that they resisted temptation. There was one of the saints, I can't remember, Sister Simplice, who, rather than telling a lie about her place of origin, was torn apart in the Roman arena by red-hot irons or something. Well, she had a heroic virtue that I would probably lack. That is, if I were asked to lie about something as trivial as where I was born, I might not resist the temptation. But it was possible for her to choose wrongly, was it not? Have any of you ever read Victor Hugo's novel, Les Miserables? I take it in that you have Jean Valjean, who was wrongly sent to the galleys because he stole a piece of bread when his children were starving. And when he comes out of the galleys, he escapes, which means he hasn't satisfied his prison sentence, doesn't it? And Javert, the detective, tries to hunt him down. And he hides in the apartments of a nun named Sister Simplice, who is named after Simplice of Sicily, because she herself had never told a lie. And when Javert asks her where Jean Valjean is, she shakes her head as if she doesn't know, telling for the first time in her life a lie, correct? And Victor Hugo says, "O sainted maid, you have joined your sisters in paradise. May you have more glory for this one lie than your entire life of truth-telling." That is, from the humanistic point of view, the lie was justified, wasn't it? Because it saved Jean Valjean from going back to the galleys and having a life of hell, even though he's lived a virtuous life. But at any rate then, it may be that a person of heroic virtue never actually chooses evil, but they must be capable of it. And if they are capable of it, some will do it. And therefore Hitler is not God's fault. The only way to avoid Hitler choosing evil would be to make Hitler a robot. There was a Spanish physiologist, I'm not sure if he's still alive, named Delgado. And he found that if he put electrodes in the brains of bulls, he could, through a computer, send out an impulse that would stop a bull in full charge. So here we have a bull that's about to gore someone, and all you have to do is have an electrode in their head and you can make the bull stop. And he, being a rather heroic sort, said, well, all people ought to have electrodes in their heads. And then if anyone was about to murder, we could just send the right impulse and freeze them, couldn't we? I think some of you can see there are problems with this, namely who you put in control of the computer. If you could assure an absolutely benevolent person in control of the computer, I guess they could prevent all murders. But there's something demeaning about it, isn't it? I mean, even if the person was absolutely benevolent, we no longer have real human beings, do we? We have robots. And your virtue would no longer be a manifestation of your free will. It would be the computer programmer's virtue, wouldn't it? He would be the only one left with free will. Maybe we would have to put an electrode in his head that someone else would control, but you then have an endless regression, don't you, of people who are controlling each other. So it would be a universe in which only one person was a true human being. So it is not God's fault. There's a wonderful novel by Thornton Wilder called The Bridge of San Luis Rey. Those of you who do not read for pleasure are missing half of life. And if you think that you don't enjoy novels, I'll name 3, and if you can read those 3 without enjoying them, you're right about yourself. You're hopeless in regard to literature. And these 3 novels are The Bridge of San Luis Rey by Thornton Wilder, The Slave by Isaac Bashevis Singer, and Spark of Life by Eric Marie Remarque. Oh, and I'd name also The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So read those 4 novels as a try, and you'll either be hooked on reading for pleasure, or you might as well go on as you are with those 4. But the one by Thornton Wilder is a very interesting novel. It starts out that on a certain day in 17 so-and-so, the finest bridge in all Peru broke and precipitated 4 travelers into the gulf below. And this was a bridge that had been there for 1,000 years, and Brother Juniper assumes that he finally can make theology an exact science, because this is clearly an act of God. You know, here this bridge that had stood for 1,000 years suddenly snapped, and a group of travelers are precipitated in the gulf below. So he begins a historical inquest as to why these people were ready to meet their Maker at that precise moment. That is, he thinks if he looks into their life history, he can see why God called them to him at exactly that time. You see his quest. And the rest of the novel is a wonderful historical investigation of 18th century Peru and telling you about the background of these people who are precipitated in the gulf below. As you can imagine, when Brother Juniper publishes his results, he's burnt for heresy, because you're not really supposed to try and figure out why God does things, are you? So it doesn't turn out well for Brother Juniper, although he goes to his death gladly, thinking, well, if he's a heretic, he deserves to be burned. But the novel is a wonderful novel, and you can see it's an effort to essentially understand the mind of God, why even what appears to be an evil is not entirely an evil. You see the point. Nonetheless, I'm not sure it entirely solves the problem of evil when we think of natural disasters. You know, here a landslide occurs and wipes out a whole village. Or here an innocent child catches a horrible illness and dies 5 years later, having been screaming in pain during all that period. So there are those who say, okay, we can explain away the evil people do to one another. That is a result of their free will. What about some of the terrible things that arise beyond human control, you know, that seem to afflict us? I'll leave you to ponder that. That is, there are those who feel that the solution to the problem of evil is adequate. There are those who have their reservations. Now let's look at the problem of free will. How can we reconcile God's all-knowingness with free will? Well, remember what God's all-knowingness means. It means that from all eternity, God has had the entire history of the universe visibly before his eyes, which is to say that his knowledge is non-discursive. That is, it's instantaneous rather than taking place over time. If I want to know how many students are here today, I have to count you over time. I don't have instantaneous knowledge of that because I'm not a perfect knower. And I might be able to count you by 3s or 5s rather than by 1s, but it'll still take me 10 seconds or so to get a count of the room, won't it? So my knowledge is discursive. It's accumulated over time, and that means it can be improved on. I mean, at the end of the 10 seconds, I have more knowledge than I did at the beginning of it, didn't I? Well, perfect knowledge would be knowledge that you couldn't add to, wouldn't it? So if God has perfect knowledge of the universe, it has been entirely intact in His mind from the day the universe was created. From the day it created, He has had an instantaneous image of its entire history. We're told that Mozart could see the structure of a symphony in virtually an instant. Have any of you seen the film Amadeus? Yes. Or you remember Salieri is confronted by Mozart's wife, and she has brought him one of Mozart's symphonies. And she says to Salieri, "Be careful of it, it's his only copy." And he says, "Firsts? You mean these are firsts?" And by that he means that he sees that Mozart has composed this entire symphony without ever crossing anything out. You know, he just wrote it from beginning to end with a seemingly perfect intuition of how he wanted to structure it. Well, I'm not claiming that Mozart was divine, that he had a godlike knowledge of music, but you can see the point. God's knowledge has been perfectly intact from all eternity. Therefore, He has known from all eternity which of us would be damned and which would be saved, hasn't He? How then is it possible to reconcile His knowledge with free will? Well, St. Thomas's solution is borrowed from Augustine. Let us imagine that that is the road of time, and here's the beginning of the universe, and here's the day of judgment, when all of us are condemned to hell, are saved in heaven. So there's the road of time that links the beginning and the end of the universe. Now, it is as if God were in a tower and could see this whole roll of time in one instant. In other words, you recall His knowledge is not in time, is it? He has instantaneous knowledge of the whole history of the universe. Now, what would that mean? Now, you're on the road of time, aren't you? And that means you can't see around the corner unless you could predict. That is, you can't see around the corner, and for you to know what happens next, something has to be determined. I know that a clock is going to strike in the clock tower in 27 minutes. How do I know that? A clock is a mechanical contrivance, isn't it? So for me to predict the future, I can't get in a time machine and go and look at it. I've got to predict it from the perspective of the present, don't I? I don't know whether this young woman will buy a Coke immediately after the lecture, because she's not a mechanical contrivance. So I can only know about the future what I can predict from the perspective of the present. Now imagine I could get into a time machine and observe her in the minute after class. Then I would know whether she was going to buy a Coke or not, wouldn't I? But she would still be a free creature. That is, knowing the future as presently before your eyes does not mean that the present must determine the future. It is only when you must predict the future from the perspective of the present. God's knowledge of the entire history of the universe is present knowledge. That is, past, present, and future are as one to Him. He sees the whole road at once. God, if I were to predict what you will do, whether you would slap someone 10 minutes from now, I would have to reduce you to a determined creature. God merely sees whether you have freely chosen to slap someone 10 minutes from now. So His kind of knowledge is merely knowledge of the outcome of free acts. Over here.
If God is atemporal and outside of
Pardon?
time. If God is atemporal. Or
Yeah, outside of time. His knowledge, at least, is outside of time.
Okay, right. Well, that being so, like, you know, how does that? It becomes a huge problem when you talk about prophecies or how he,
Yes.
you know, becomes.
This is one of the objections to St. Thomas. That is, if the present, past, and future are non-distinguishable to God, how could He ever perform a miracle in the history of the universe? You would think that He would sort of intervene blindly. You know, he might have, rather than having the Red Sea roll back when the children of Israel were approaching it, it might have rolled back 10 years too soon.
Yeah,
And
yes,
that wouldn't be very helpful, would it? So this is one of the problems. This is, by the way, not a specialty of 9. One of the philosophers here I'm trying to recall her name. Those of you, pardon? Yes, she is a philosopher of time who explores such problems. I'm just an amateur on this point. You could always say, okay, God sees a series of snapshots, but as long as he has the snapshots in the proper order, he could pick one. Now, of course, one of the answers to that is, if you really had a group of snapshots, you wouldn't know whether time was running backward or forward. You know, it would be the same sequence, wouldn't it? But you wouldn't know which way they were going. The answer to that usually is, but if God has knowledge of causality, he can distinguish cause and effect, and that would allow him to put the snapshots in the proper order. But again, these are the sort of theological problems that I can't in this course, I don't want in this course to resolve for you. I mean, if you are a believing Christian, these are the problems you've got. And it's over to you to satisfy yourself rather than for me to propagandize you on it. But as you can see, it's a very ingenious solution, but it does cause problems, doesn't it? I mean, if God's knowledge is literally outside of time, how could he intervene in time? But it does seem, on one level at least, to solve the problem. Now, there are pseudo-solutions that don't work. Calvin took, of course, the heroic thing to saying, well, we are predetermined creatures. He believed in predestination, didn't he? You know, if you were born a member of the elect, you were predestined to be saved. If you weren't, you weren't. Well, he had a strong stomach, because most of us find that an obnoxious idea, that some of us are predetermined to be saved, and others of us are predetermined to be damned. We would prefer that our fate lies in our own use of our free will, wouldn't we? And certainly St. Thomas did not like a doctrine of predestination. William James, an American philosopher, tried a way out of this way. He said, well, maybe, imagine I were playing a chess grandmaster. I would have absolute free will as to which moves I chose, but the end of the game is certain. I'm going to lose, right? Well, that doesn't help very much, because what is predetermined and what isn't? That is, what is the stake in the game? If the stake in the game is my salvation, it's not much solace to me that I can choose about 5 different roads of being damned. You know, maybe I do have a choice as to the precise moves, right? But the outcome is still predetermined, isn't it? So if God knows whether I'm going to be saved or damned, and I have free will only over trivia, you have to break the connection between God's foreknowledge and a set outcome. Or I should say, the future is set, but it's not determined. From all eternity, God has known whether you would make the free choices that would lead to your salvation or the free choices that would lead to your damnation. Yet those choices are free. You see the point? This is St. Thomas's view. It's as if you had a time machine and could look at what I did after I freely chose to do it. And that kind of non-discursive knowledge supposedly does not create a problem. What about causality and free will? This, of course, we can detach from its theological setting. There are many scientists who think that they will eventually be able to predict all events through science, don't they? And if all things are predictable through science, let's say if I had a sufficient knowledge of your brain physiology, I could predict everything you would do the rest of your life. Where's the room for moral virtue? That is, a charitable person just has a different arrangement of matter in their brain from an uncharitable person, right? Now, the Jesuit psychologists, of course, have done a great deal of thinking about this problem. That's because they teach both theology and psychology. So obviously, they have to find how they can teach scientific psychology and still salvage free will, don't they? Now, some of them say this: evolution is capable of producing new things. We call this emergent evolution. I take it at one time only matter existed in the universe, didn't it? Non-living matter. And at a certain point, we evolved carbon compounds that were sufficiently long and complicated that they became self-replicating. And then you had living matter, didn't you? And at one point, no living matter was conscious. You know, earthworms have a very, well, plants have a very low level of consciousness. So evolution produced something new, creatures with self-awareness. The creatures that we know to have self-awareness are human beings and the higher apes. The reason we know that an ape has a self-awareness that a dog doesn't is that an ape recognizes its image in the mirror as itself, while a dog doesn't. For a dog, an image in a mirror is always another dog. An ape, it sees itself in the mirror. One of the first things it will do is touch itself and see if the image touches itself. Or if it has a smudge on its fur, it will take that smudge off and see if it disappears in the mirror. So I take it evolution produced something new, that is, creatures who had an awareness that they were conscious creatures. And the Jesuits say, why should not evolution eventually produce a creature who can make free choices by the present self? You know, here you are at this moment and you're wondering whether to visit a friend, which would be charitable, or to go to a movie, which would be self-indulgence, correct? Well, if you sit there and wait for a billiard ball to knock you towards the theater or towards the hospital, you'll wait forever, won't you? I mean, you have to treat yourself at least as if you were free, don't you? You can't say, I'm a determined creature. In a little while, my brain physiology will either set me out the door towards St. Mary's Hospital or set me out the door towards the Octagon Theater. Well, you'll wait a long time, won't you? You have to at least indulge in the illusion of making up your mind. And the Jesuits would say, how do we know that's an illusion? It may be that free will has produced a state of consciousness that can break the chain of causality. I have a chapter on this in my most recent book. The last chapter, Where Have All the Liberals Gone, takes up free will versus determinism. And again, I'm not trying to say that the Jesuits are right. I'm an agnostic on this. I think none of us know yet whether free will is genuine or an illusion. I don't think that we have the knowledge that would allow us to evaluate it. But you can at least see why it's logically possible that there could be the chain of causality we call evolution, and evolution could create not only a living creature, not only a creature with consciousness, not only a creature with self-awareness, but a creature where the present self can make free choices. It's not a logically impossible thing for something radically new to be evolved through the chain of causality. At one time, Catholics could be followers of Malebranche or Descartes. That is, Descartes invented a problem that I don't think is a real problem. It was essentially, how can mind and body interact? You can see how one immaterial billiard ball could hit and move another, can't you? But it's very hard to see how an immaterial billiard ball could hit a material one and move it. And that created the problem. How could a mental event in my mind, deciding to pick up a stick, cause a material thing, namely my arm, to pick up the stick? It seems to be an immaterial billiard ball hitting and moving a material one, doesn't it? And Descartes essentially said that God had to plug in the connection, that it was a miracle. Every time that you decided to do something, the only reason why your body could obey your mind's command is that God operated sort of like a gigantic switchboard operator who plugged into the connection. As Voltaire pointed out, that made God an accomplice to every murder. That is, every time you decided to murder someone, you couldn't have done it unless God miraculously plugged in the connection. Leibniz came up with the two clocks theory. He said, mind never does influence matter. It's just that from all eternity, your mental clock has been synchronized with your bodily clock. That is, imagine I had two clocks, and one was always timed to strike a moment before the other. then it would look like the first clock was causing the second to strike, wouldn't it? I mean, there'd be no actual connection between them, but we would have that illusion. But of course, the two clocks theory did away with free will completely, didn't it? I mean, my mind was now just a clock, all of whose mental decisions were determined from all eternity. You see the point. So eventually the church said, no, you couldn't be a Cartesian and you couldn't follow Malebranche, you had to follow St. Thomas. And you can see why the church decided that. Namely, they thought that the only plausible solution to the problem of free will was St. Thomas's solution. And these other things just got you into deep water. We have still one other problem. Scripture tells us that the universe had a start and time. Now, that doesn't seem to be logically necessary. From all time, there has been one necessary being, but why couldn't God, as necessary being, have maintained the physical universe in existence? You know, He's existed forever. Why shouldn't He have had a universe, a material universe that He created in existence as long as He was? You see the point. Well, St. Thomas says this is a matter of faith. There's no reason in logic why the universe could not have existed as long as God has. It would have always been contingent. He would have always been necessary, sustaining it in existence. He says, but we can see that it is logically possible for the universe to have had a start and time. And he uses the analogy of external and immanent factors. Now, the best way to make that clear to you is for me to talk about a carpenter. I take it for a carpenter to be a perfect knower, his knowledge of carpentry would have to be intact from all eternity. If he or she could add to his knowledge of carpentry, then it wasn't perfect a moment ago, was it? So for an internal virtue like knowledge, it's true that God's knowledge of the universe had to be perfectly intact from all eternity. But actions are different. It would be no compromise of the perfection of a carpenter if over time he made 1,000 chairs, or she made 1,000 chairs. Because if the carpenter was learning something through practice, that would be bad. But we're assuming that every chair is a perfect chair, okay? Well, you don't have to make your life's quota of chairs at a particular time to be a perfect carpenter. So it was no compromise of God's omnipotence that He created the universe with a start and time. That is, He had to have His knowledge perfectly intact from all eternity. He did not have to exercise the potency of His creativity from all eternity to be omnipotent. Just as the carpenter didn't have to today have made his lifetime quota of chairs to be a perfectly potent carpenter. That is, one capable of making good chairs. You see the point. This brings us to the final point. St. Thomas would not claim that he can demonstrate everything of Christian belief. For example, he can't demonstrate a mystery like the Trinity, because the Trinity, three persons and one God, is a mystery that the human mind can't comprehend. It apparently is beyond us, just as mathematics is beyond an earthworm. We have to have faith that this means something, but we can't prove it. Similarly, we can't prove the universe had a start and time. We can only show that that is logically possible and believe it on faith. But St. Thomas says that since reason can demonstrate 90% of what we believe, doesn't that cast credibility on the other 10%? And his answer, of course, is in the affirmative. Well, next time we'll go on to look at St. Thomas's moral and political philosophy.